Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I talk with Gina DeLapa about the 7 C's of leadership. Gina DeLapa, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have this conversation. We've been in contact and preparing for this for a little while now, and I look forward to talking to you about your 7 C's of leadership. And you have a tremendous background and a lot of expertise that you're going to bring to the table for our listeners. As we get started, I just wanted to share Gina's bio with everybody. Gina DeLapa is the president of Thriving Cultures, LLC, and the author of Thriving at Work. Make your mark, lead with confidence, stomp out drama, get home by 6. As a university career counselor, Gina DeLapa noticed an unsettling trend. The university was helping graduates get jobs, but not preparing them to succeed once on the job. Gina left the university, became certified as a corporate etiquette consultant from the prestigious Protocol School of Washington in Washington, D.C., and began helping companies teach professional etiquette to new college hires. She has since expanded her reach to help companies create thriving cultures at every level, from college intern to CEO. When every team member works from a leadership mindset, performance increases, drama decreases, and culture becomes a competitive advantage. As a speaker, trainer, and coach, Gina has successfully taught both the mindset of leadership and the skill set. Known for her ability to connect with audiences at every level, Gina has inspired audiences nationwide, from Moss Adams and on the West Coast to the Deutsche Bank on Wall Street. Gina has also served as a sought-after adjunct faculty member in the graduate counseling program at the University of San Diego, where she earned a master's degree in counseling with an emphasis in career development. Gina credits her parents for putting her to work starting at age 10 in the family pizza business. Growing up in an entrepreneurial family taught her how to see company culture through the dual lens of employer and employee. So that's amazing. What a great background. I love really everything that you're about. And I also, we share a piece of commonality as we were raised. I started working at the age of 10 as well. But we had a series of, not as anything as grand as a family business, but we had family paper routes. And so I started at the age of 10, helping get up early in the morning on the family paper routes.
Oh, that's funny, John. We should compare notes on salaries, because I'm pretty sure you would best me on. I still tease my parents. They paid me 50 cents an hour. Like, my first paycheck was $3. Like, that's 6 hours, which for a 10-year-old, that's a big chunk of my life, you know. But I'm fortunate to have 3 older brothers, so all the paper routes went to them. So I never did a paper route, but I did some other jobs that were kind of on that level. So yeah, well, and we have both, I've taught in academia as an adjunct, but you're an associate professor. So you're the real deal. But I'm sure we could compare notes on that level as well. Just having the privilege of influencing the next generation of leaders and meeting them where they are, and sharing some wisdom, but also learning from them.
Absolutely. And I do love academia. I love being at the university. I love teaching. I love the energy of the university space, even though it's a little different right now due to COVID.
Right.
But that's all so much fun. But I also like the practitioner side of things. And so we share that in common as well, where we get to do the academic stuff, but we also get to do the practitioner stuff and help real people and real organizations, learn to thrive and to be more effective. So that's what gets me up in the morning.
Yes, and my guess is that your practitioner side supports the academic side and makes you more effective in that realm, and vice versa, that the two are somewhat mutually implicative.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's enjoyable for me, but it's definitely of benefit to the students, and vice versa for the for it pulling my research into what I do on the practitioner side. So
Right, and students are pretty astute. They notice these things, and they notice when you bring something real to the table in that way. So yeah, kudos to you.
well, so such an interesting background. I'm wondering if, as we get started and before we really launch in, we can talk a little bit more about your book and the 7 C's of leadership.
Sure.
Anything else, though, by way of personal background, context that you would like to share with listeners to help them get a feel for who you are, where you're at, and those sorts of things?
Well, let's see here. I think maybe the only thing I would add that might be helpful for people to hear right now is the career counselor in me knows that everything in your background, whether it looks like it relates or not, somehow does. And so take heart that if you are in a stopgap job or not in your dream job right now, it's serving a purpose. And that was one thing my parents imparted to me very young. Every job has something to teach you. And don't ever think, well, my career path doesn't make any sense, because if you wait a long enough time, you'll look back and you'll realize, oh, I see how these threads connect and how this helped me with that. I could give you a lot of examples of that, but I would rather have listeners reflect on their own career path and take some time to connect the dots, because they are there and they do connect. And I hope that gives listeners some added hope for these incredibly uncertain times.
Well, I appreciate that. And I do think that's an important note, is that very few of us have linear paths, right? Of just linear progression. Like, we're zigzagging all over the place. And,
We should.
and frankly, linear is kind of boring. So I think the zigzag is what it's all about. And we gain insights and experiences along the way. And, I'm sure you can say the same thing. I can look back to all of the kind of weird, crazy jobs I've had over the years. And every single one of them has taught me something important. And every single one of them has informed my future decisions that have helped to get me to where I'm at. So I wouldn't take any of those back. I wouldn't redo any of it. Even though, now I sitting where I am, I could be tempted to look back and think, oh, it would have been so much easier if I would have just done everything in a straight line.
Right.
You know what? Nothing would have turned out the way it did if I had done it
exactly. Right. It's easier to look back and be wistful and say, what if, but like you said, you would have missed out on all those little subtle moves that add up. There's a book I read just before going back to grad school years ago called The Way of Transition by William Bridges. He was known as kind of the transitions guy, but he talked about, you mentioned how linear is boring, and I completely agree. When I hear a 17 or 18-year-old say, I want to be an investment banker, I think, don't you really want to have a band? Because you should at that age. How can you know that? You don't even know who you're taking to prom, and now suddenly you want to work. I mean, it sounds good and it sounds confident, but is it really you? And so I would encourage people, especially if they've got young adults in their house, to reflect on that. Yeah, it doesn't all have to be neat and perfect. But William Bridges talked in his book about what was the analogy he used? Kind of the organic approach versus sort of the fertilizer. And he said life isn't kind of this neat 3-2-1 formula, and gave some examples from his own life how the most seemingly random things led to the connections that made him who he was. So again, even amidst the uncertainty that we're all in unwittingly, trust that things do connect and do work out.
Yeah, and maybe along those lines, I also feel like as I reflect back on my experiences, that if I'm honest with myself, I can't, my present self can't take a lot of credit for my present successes, right? My
Right.
present self owes my successes to my past self. And so
Yeah.
in some cases there are relationships or projects that was working on and started 10 years ago or more,
Right.
that it takes time to germinate, and only after that incubation period do things start to bear fruit. And honestly, like, there are things where I laid the groundwork a decade and a half ago, that are only now starting to really bear fruit. And so, if we can play the long game and do the small things we need to do each and every day,
Mhm.
um, it will pay off. That won't necessarily mean it pays off in a linear fashion, but it will pay off.
Right. And it may not pay off in the way you expect, but I'll give you a quick example from my career. When I was getting the master's in counseling for a career development emphasis, I remember being in a panel interview at Grand Valley State University, and they asked, "What's one of your goals going forward?" And then I think the first thing out of my mouth was, "Well, I look forward to getting paid for this work, because as an intern, you're not only not getting paid, you're paying for the privilege of doing an internship." And I said that tongue in cheek. We all pay our dues, and I'm on board with that. But one of the other major goals, I just had this desire to get licensed in the state of Michigan, just because that's where I was working. And it's a 2-year process, and it's quite involved. There's a lot of documentation. There are very specific steps. But I had no idea when I did that that I would be opening the door to teaching, teaching at the graduate level. And that was life changing. I mean, I did that, as I said, for the better part of 10 years. I influenced all kinds of students, and they influenced me. And it was, I can attest to how labor intensive teaching is when you're doing it right and you're really reading the papers and all of that, and putting some real effort into that. But it was, yes, it was labor intensive. It was also one of the most rewarding chapters in my career. It would not have been possible, and I could have never foreseen that getting that license would open that door, because at the time that I entered teaching, there was no licensure in the state of California. So the fact that I had a license anywhere was a plus, and that was, and I didn't even have to ask. I was asked, which is nice. It's always wonderful. I'm sure you can attest to this. When opportunities find you, that's when you know you're on a good track. And I'm sure our listeners can relate to that too. It's like, I wasn't even looking for such and such, and it turned out to be the best thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said is absolutely correct, that things don't always work out the way we planned. My experience has been that in most cases things have worked out better than I had planned. You put together your best possible plan, and then you end up zigzagging, and then as long as you're open to opportunity and you're constantly trying to grow, then usually, my feeling is the universe unfolds before you in a way that's even better than what you thought.
Oh,
um,
I agree. In fact, my first week of graduate school, we had to write a brief paper on where we expected to be at the end of the program. And I remember giving a speech to some honors students in the program who came many years after me. And I told them about this experience, and I wanted to have 2 job offers, one in California, one in Michigan. I wanted to have book, uh, a book contract and this and that. And I said, that's called fantasy fiction. As it turns out, I had one job interview. I had one job offer, and I had a contract to write some columns, so not a book. But again, I only needed one job, and I found the one I most wanted. And the articles, the columns that I ended up writing, it was the first time I was getting paid to write in my own voice. And as a bonus, my nephew at Michigan State had a management professor who knew nothing of me or our family, assigned one of my articles in class. And so he got to read one of my articles, and to me, that's just a good little story, and I'll always cherish that. But yeah, make your plans as bold as you wish. But again, yes, I agree. Be prepared for something even better. I didn't know at the end of my grad program I'd be working in academia for a number of years. That wasn't even on my radar, but the internships presented themselves. And as I got more confident with my skills, I realized, like you, I like academia. I like the energy of it. I like the collegiality and the emphasis on excellence and the standards. There was just a lot about it that I really felt at home with. And yeah, so that was home for a number of years.
Excellent. Well, I imagine as I'm hearing you share a little bit about your story, I can envision how this kind of goes back in time to your early days as a 10-year-old working in the family business. Before we go and talk about the 7Cs, I thought maybe we could just take a few minutes and talk a little bit about maybe any sort of culture or leadership types of lessons you learned as you started at a young age working in the family business and being around this entrepreneurial kind of spirit.
Yeah. Just again, quick background for our listeners. So as I mentioned, or I think you mentioned in the bio, my parents started a pizza business, a takeout pizza business in the family garage. And this was actually a couple years before I was born. So from my earliest memories are at the breakfast table and the dinner table, hearing nightly or morning little mini seminars on some form of employee engagement. We didn't use that term, of course, but we heard about the hirings and the firings. And I remember the first time I heard about a firing, I was 5 and I was terrified. Somebody got set on fire. I mean, that's what I was envisioning. But so it really taught me what managers expect, because by the time the business moved out of the garage, it was growing. And by the time my parents sold it 13 years later, it had 250 employees, including, my parents' 4 kids, my brothers and I. And my parents never had us work directly under them or even around them, which was, I think, helpful. So we gladly stood on our own 2 feet, but it made me realize from a very early age, John, that there's the management worldview and there's what employees expect in return. And so I really got to see that covenant, if you will. I think back in those days, it was more of a covenant than it is today. But I got to see that relationship through the dual lens and really appreciate what the other brought to the table and what the needs were. And sometimes they were at cross currents, but not always. I would watch my parents do the same thing, for example, to 2 different employees or 2 different groups of employees, and get a very different reaction. They'd go out of their way to be generous or fair, as an example, and some would be extremely grateful and respectful for the opportunity, and others, there was just kind of no pleasing them. But again, in a company that size, human dynamics being what they are, there were ups, downs, dramas. So it, acclimated me to all of that at an early age.
Yeah. And I think those types of life lessons early on do benefit us as we grow into ourselves and grow into our careers, moving forward. And so I imagine as you're going through, developing your book, the ideas for your book, and as you go about your coaching work and some of your other professional work, that it's probably not too uncommon for you to reflect back on how it connects with, something you learned, as a teenager working in a family business.
Right. And I would also add too, and I still sometimes, rib my father about this. He's 86 now, but I'll say things like, you entrepreneurs think everybody's as excited as you are about your idea, and you can't assume that's the case, or you can't assume that any employee can do any job if they just say yes enough. I mean, that's one of the things that makes entrepreneurs successful, but at the same time, it can be exasperating to the people around them. They're so driven, and they want everybody to be as driven as they are, and that's not always reality. And I think one of the things I learned just as a career counselor is, you know what? Not everybody is looking for their dream job. If they are, more power to them. We can find ways to help them be inspired and empowered at work, but we shouldn't assume, because for some people, the real juice is outside of work. And I heard Steve Harvey say recently, your career is what you're paid for, your calling is what you're made for.
I like that.
Yeah, I do too.
So let's transition now and talk more about your book. And if you wouldn't mind laying out for us what your 7 C's are and maybe provide a few examples.
Sure. Okay. So the 7 C's are character, competence, courage, confidence, communication, class, and credibility. And the nice thing about credibility is if you do 1 through 6, character, competence, courage, confidence, communication, class, you will have credibility in pretty much everything you do. But as you can imagine, John, most or all of these are really being tested right now. And I think especially courage, just because there is so much uncertainty and managers are seeing much more intimately, do I trust myself to lead during this time? Do I trust my staff to work at home and do what they are supposed to do? I hope the answer is yes. If it is, that means you've done your work as a manager. You've instilled and cultivated those things in your team. If you don't trust, and unfortunately, I've heard of some managers who don't, that's an invitation, I would say, to look within yourself and say, why is that? And what needs to change? And what part of this problem is mine? Start there. But yeah, so I mean, I wrote this book, in 2018, so before COVID, obviously, but I think COVID is just taking the need for these 7, and it's not changing them, but it's greatly turning up the volume.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of that credibility element, and really all of your C's. I mean, none of them are, rocket science. It's all fairly straightforward. In some cases, we might even be tempted to say common sense. But the problem is, it's whether someone knows it, conceptually or not. The practice of it is sometimes easier said than done, right? Because we recognize the need for these things. It's not super complicated, but it takes concerted, consistent, sustainable effort over time. And that's where a lot of it falls short for many managers or leaders.
Right. I agree. These do not require advanced degrees or a degree at all. But yes, it does take, as you said, conscious effort and empathy, really seeing things through the lens of the other. So if you have to give constructive feedback, or if you have to do layoffs, which are unfortunately a big reality right now, if you can simply look at it through the lens of the person on the other end to say, how am I getting this message across? Is it giving that person their full dignity, their full respect, or am I taking the easy way out to make myself comfortable? I mean, these days, nobody expects the news to be great all the time, but control what you can. You can be transparent. You can be mindful of the timing. So, you don't give horrible news on a Friday night. I wouldn't. Just kind of leaves them with nothing to do but ruminate all weekend, and maybe who knows? You know what I'm saying? I read this recently, and I agree. If you've got to let someone go, as an example, do it earlier in the week so that they've got some time to hit the ground running if they want, or explore other options. They're not you can't get much done on a Saturday or a Sunday. But that's just one example. The overarching point here is look for ways to be empathic and to have some humility. And that doesn't mean low self-esteem. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking less about yourself.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does. It just takes effort, and again, but if you resolve, I'm going to lead with confidence and class, many of the other things will fall into place.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, it's about developing trust with your people, right?
Yeah.
And that then builds into all of the areas that you mentioned that are fleshed out in your book. And um, and we need good leadership right now. The world needs good leadership. Your organization needs good leadership. So for anyone listening, I would encourage you to check out Gina's book, uh, glean some really great ideas from it, and see what can you do to shift some behaviors and some ways you interact that might have a positive impact on your people and your team as a whole, um, help lift everybody. Everyone right now needs a lift,
Yeah.
and we have that capability within us.
Yeah, we do. And it doesn't take much. The smallest gestures can mean the most. But yeah, we do need strong leaders. And we don't need perfect leaders, but we need leaders who are willing to stumble from time to time, but get back up and apologize if necessary, or go seek out additional training or additional coaching, whatever it takes. People learn in different ways. I completely respect that. But no one's going to, and this is another thing I learned as a career counselor and in my years at the university, no one's going to care as much about your career as you do, or your development. So if there's something you need, whether you're in a formal leadership position or not, there's so much information out there. Set up a little discipline of reading or listening to something educational like John's podcast, to increase your capacity to lead and serve. And you do those two things, nothing's going to stop you.
Excellent. Well, Gina,
province here.
it has been a real pleasure talking with you today.
Likewise.
We're about out of time, but before we close, I just wanted to give you a chance to give the last word and share with listeners how they can get connected with you and find out more about what you're doing.
Sure. Okay. So you can find my website at GinaDeLapa.com, Gina, D as in David, ELAPA. Again, my book is Thriving at Work. If you just enter that into Amazon, actually, I think 2 books will come up, but only one by yours truly. And on my website, John, when people go, there will be a very unobtrusive pop-up for a free download called 50 Traits of Effective Leaders. And it's beautifully organized. My assistant helped me just make it look very nice and digestible, if you will. But that's been a big hit with readers. And so I would encourage our listeners to go to GinaDeLapa.com and get their free download. There's no obligation, and it's a good reference for everything that we've been talking about and a good support.
Well, thank you, Gina. It has been a real pleasure. I wish you all the best. I hope listeners will reach out, get connected, find out more about Gina, what we can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe. I hope you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.
We are excited about the launch of HCI's new magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine designed to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We will be publishing issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Check out the first issue and let us know what you think. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.